Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the EAZA Animal Welfare webinar. I will now introduce you to our guest speaker today. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor 𝗫𝗃𝗏 from the University, so the Autonomous University of Barcelona, where he is a professor. He did his PhD and bachelor's there, and did his MSc in animal welfare at the University of Edinburgh. He's a diplomat of the European College of Animal Welfare and Behavioural Medicine, a partner in the EU-commissioned Animal Welfare Quality Framework and Network. He's an official advisor to the EAZA Animal Welfare Working Group, and is a member of the Animal Health and Welfare of the European Food Safety Authority Working Group. He has over 100 publications to his name, so I think it's obvious to say he is one of the world's leading experts in animal welfare, and we're very honoured to have him do the webinar for us today. So thank you very much, 𝗫𝗃𝗏, and I will unshare my screen and hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sally, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or evening, depending on where you are. First of all, I would like to thank EAZA for inviting me to deliver this webinar on the fundamentals of animal welfare assessment. And in particular, I would like to thank Sally Binding for all the organization and for the kind introduction. Now, what I would like to do over the next 45 minutes or so is to combine some fundamental thoughts on animal welfare science with a number of more applied insights into welfare assessments, so that we can cover the basics and the applied side of it. And I like to do it following. Okay, like to do it following this plan here. I will start with an introduction, basically to set the scene and to reflect on the magnitude of the challenge we have when it comes to assessing the welfare of zoo animals. And then after presenting the challenge, I like to argue that we have knowledge and several tools to address that challenge, at least to some extent. And I will go through those tools, which are existing protocols, knowledge on natural history, particularly on natural behavior, and on how important it is for the welfare of animals, knowledge on the links between health and welfare, and finally, what we know about welfare indicators that may be applicable to a wide variety of species. And after that, I will finish my talk with a summary and a number of take-home messages. Okay, so let's then get started with the introduction, which, as I said, is meant to reflect briefly on the magnitude of the challenge we face. And let me start showing you this slide. Probably many of you are familiar with the welfare quality protocols. They were developed to assess the welfare of domestic cattle, domestic pigs, and domestic chickens. Now, the reason I am showing you these protocols to start my talk is because I think they illustrate very well the magnitude of that challenge. And why is that? Well, these welfare quality protocols were developed within a project that lasted more than 4 years. It involved 44 institutions, scientific institutions from 17 countries across Europe and America. And the project, the welfare quality project, had a significant funding. And yet, the project focused on 3 species: domestic cattle, domestic pigs, and domestic chickens, which happen to be very well known in terms of behavior, diseases, and environmental requirements. So think about it: 4 years, 44 institutions, significant funding, and we got 3 protocols for 3 well-known species. If you compare that with the situation we face with zoo animals, the difference is huge. Now, we are talking about hundreds or probably thousands of species, many of them very poorly known indeed. And it is not only the number of species, but also their amazing diversity. Now, remember that the main reason why we assess welfare is to improve it. And we want to improve it mainly because animals are sentient beings. And science tells us that sentience does not belong only to mammals and birds, but also to reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and some invertebrates. And you can read that in the Cambridge Declaration that appears on this slide here. So it is a vast number of species, but also species which are extremely diverse, 5, 6, 7 taxons, so not just mammals and birds. And some of these species are very poorly known, as I said, in general, and even less so when it comes to their welfare. Now, we do have an interest in the welfare of reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and invertebrates, but the number of papers on this particular issue is still very limited. This is an example of a very, very interesting paper that has been recently published in the journal Animal Welfare, looking at abnormal repetitive behavior in one species of a snake, and the difficulties to modify that, presumably, that sign of poor welfare. So there is interest, yes, but there is a lot we don't know yet about the welfare and even the basic biology of many of the species we have to deal with. So the challenge is really, really significant. And the good side of it, however, is that, as I said in the introduction, I believe that we have some tools to address that challenge, at least to some extent. And I will spend the rest of my talk just going through those tools that I believe may help us a long way to at least try to do some work in terms of assessing zoo animal welfare. Now, and the first tool we have existing protocols. Have been published several protocols to assess the welfare of zoo animals. The extent to which these protocols have been validated may vary, but nevertheless, these existing protocols are very useful, either to be used as they are or to be used as a starting point. And just to make a long story short, these existing protocols can be divided into two main categories. We have, to start with, protocols that have been developed to assess the welfare of one species in particular. Now, the sea whale protocol is a well-known example of these protocols intended for one species, in this case, the bottlenose dolphin. And here is just another example of a protocol developed to assess the welfare of elephants under human care. And of course, if you happen to deal with species for which we have one of these specific protocols, well, that's excellent news. In some cases, you can be lucky as well, because perhaps some of these protocols that have been developed for one specific species, can be used for closely related species. For example, this protocol developed for Dorcas gazelles is likely to be useful as well for other species of gazelles or even for other species of ruminants. So that would be, if you want, the easy part of it. If you happen to be interested in dolphins, elephants, gazelles, and some other species, you are lucky because you already have something which to some extent can be used, as I said before, either as it is or as a starting point. But the truth is that more often than not, you will be dealing with a species for which we do not have any specific protocol. So what do we do then? Well, what we can do then is to look at the second type of protocols, of existing protocols, which are those which I may call general protocols. So protocols which are intended to be used for a wide variety of species. And if you go to the EAZA webpage, to the animal welfare section, you will find this animal welfare assessments library, where you may find many of these general protocols. And basically, if you look at them, you will see that there are a checklist of questions or issues that have to be addressed when assessing the welfare of animals. Now, if you look at this list of general protocols for the first time, it might be that you feel a little bit confused or overwhelmed because there are very many. But the good news is that many, or most, or even all of them, in my view, agree at least on two fundamental things, which are very important when we are trying to design new welfare assessments tools. So the first agreement refers to the sort of things we have to include in any welfare assessment protocol. And by and large, the existing protocols coincide, at least to some extent, that we have to look at 4 areas. That's feeding, physical health, understood as the absence of disease and injury, environment, and behavior. And it is no coincidence that these 4 main aspects or elements of welfare that must be included in any welfare assessment tool, these 4 elements basically coincide with the 4 physical domains of the 5 domains model. Probably many of you are familiar with the 5 domains model. I think it's an extremely useful approach to animal welfare that has been updated several times over the last years. And very recently, a few weeks ago, the last update was published. So it's worth having a look at this paper, not only because it is the most recent update of the model, but also because it emphasizes the importance of human-animal interactions when assessing the welfare of animals. And I will go back to this issue of human-animal interactions in zoo animals because I think they are fundamentally important when we assess the welfare of zoo animals, with the added complexity that unlike what happens with farm animals, where we have stock people or companion animals, where we have the owner of the pet animal, here we have at least 2 different categories of human beings involved or affecting the welfare of zoo animals, so the visitors, the public, and the keepers. But again, human-animal interactions are fundamentally important. Now, getting back to my main message here, when we look at these general protocols, one agreement is that we have to organize our tool, our assessment tool, whatever it might be, into 4 main areas: health, feeding, environment, and behavior. Now, if you look in detail at these general protocols, you may realize that some of them appear to deviate a little bit from that general structure, but not so much so really. So take, for example, the Wild Planet Trust assessment tool, which I find extremely useful, and that has been translated into several languages, and you will have you can find the translations on the EAZA webpage. The Wild Planet Trust tool is organized around 4 aspects: health, environment, stressors, and behavior, which do not fully coincide apparently with the ones I just mentioned. But if you look at the protocol in detail, you will see that under health, there are some questions that refer to feeding, so both aspects, health and feeding, are covered. And then under stressors, they include many behavioral issues, plus one aspect that I like to emphasize, which is whether animals are able to avoid stressors. And this leads me to my next point in this first section of my talk. So we have these 4 general elements or aspects: health, feeding, environment, and behavior. plus this issue of whether animals are able to avoid the stressors. And that takes us to the concept of control and choice, which I think should be included as well in any assessment tool. So the Wild Planet Trust has it. This other protocol, the 24/7, which is based around the 4 principles of animal welfare, of the welfare quality approach, which again coincide with the 4 physical domains of the 5 dominion model. This protocol has an additional question, which is whether animals have perceived control. So, so far, to recap a little bit, imagine you are facing a situation where you want to assess the welfare of one species for which there is a published protocol. Well, great, you are lucky. You can use that as it is or use it as a starting point and modify it if you wish. But now imagine, which is very likely, that you are dealing with a species for which there is no existing protocol. Then I would recommend you go to this library of the EAZA webpage, look at the general protocols and get an idea of the aspects for which there is a general agreement. And one of these aspects, so number 1, is that when you organize your assessment, you have to consider 4 elements: health, behavior, feeding, and environment. A second agreement is that you have to include as well questions to assess whether animals have this perceived control, this ability to avoid stressors. And this is extremely important because current research, and I mean, not just current, I mean, even classical research about animal stress and animal welfare tells us that the ability to control, or the perception of control, reduces not only the magnitude of the stress response, but particularly the damaging effects of a very intense or long-lasting stress response. And this, in practice, can be applied in different contexts in zoo animals. For example, and let's back to the human-animal interaction. We know that more often than not, the presence of public is stressful for zoo animals. Of course, this is a rather complicated issue. It depends on the species, the individual animal, the behavior of the public, and the facilities. Right, agreed. But it is true that very often the presence of public is stressful. So it is a welfare, maybe a welfare issue. Well, if you think about this perception of control, designing your facilities in a way that animals can decide when and how and whether they are exposed to the public is something that will have an impact on their welfare. And you should include questions to address that issue in your assessment tool. This perception of control in many different aspects, including this human-animal relationship. And control is closely related to choice. And we have very nice examples in polar bears, in giant pandas, in ruminants in petting zoos, for example, showing that when animals have a choice, when they have the ability to decide where to go and what to do in different places of the facility, their welfare is improved. Even if they don't use much some parts of the facility, the simple fact of having the choice of using them has a positive effect on the welfare. So to cut a long story short, just remember the 4 main elements of animal welfare. They have to be in your assessment tool, whatever the species, and I would suggest you add to those specific questions on perceived control and ability to choose. And from here, you start building your protocol if you don't have any to use for the species you are interested in. Now, another aspect for which there is a wide consensus, a general agreement across these general protocols is the fact that when assessing the welfare of zoo animals, and for that sake of any animal, we should use a combination of the 2 main types of welfare indicators, resource-based and animal-based indicators. Now, recently we have put a particular emphasis on animal-based indicators because they provide direct information on the welfare status of the animals. So whenever possible, use them. So things such as body condition, behavior, physiology, clinical signs, whatever you may gather from the animals themselves, that's fine. But don't forget that very often looking at the environment is going to be very important as well. So try to combine both the animals themselves and the facilities and the environment, and you will get the best possible assessment of the welfare of the animals. Okay, so we have, I think, a sound starting point on which many welfare scientists would agree. So again, consider the 4 elements, add questions about perception of control and choice, and address all those by using a combination of animal-based and resource-based indicators. But of course, this is only a starting point. We have to tailor that general principles to the particular biology of the species we are interested in. And I will like to discuss in this next section and in the following one, how we do that, how we tailor this general approach to the biology of each species as it relates to behavior first and health later on. Okay, so behavior. What sort of questions should we be asking about the behavior of the animals? And more precisely, to what extent is our knowledge on the natural history or the natural behavior of the animal in question relevant? Now, the truth is that several assessment tools refer to natural behavior, natural diet, and so on. And some tools even use natural history to identify problem areas or perceive problem areas. When there is a gap, a significant difference between natural history or natural environment, natural behavior, and conditions in the zoo or in the aquarium, some tools point that as a possible welfare issue. And in principle, it makes sense to use natural history and natural behavior as a guiding principle, as a starting point. But the question is it right to use natural history and particularly natural behavior as a baseline to assess welfare? If it is, I think that provides a lot of information on what sort of questions we should ask. But if it is not, it can be misleading. Well, and the reality is that it has been a lot of discussion about the problems to use natural behavior to assess the welfare of animals under human care. And these are just some ideas from this paper by 𝗫𝘃𝗶𝗿 and colleagues, 1996, where they very clearly explain what are the limitations of this approach, what are the problems of using natural behavior and compare it with behavior in captivity to assess welfare. One important problem is that some behaviors are stimulus-driven, and hence they are context-dependent or context-specific. So they may be important for the welfare of the animal in a particular environment, but not so much in a different environment, depending on the environment itself. If that is the case, then the fact that the animal does not show that particular behavior in captivity and it does in the wild, or vice versa, that doesn't imply necessarily any welfare problem. Related to this is the fact that behavior is very flexible. So in theory, at least, the welfare of animals can be equally good with animals showing different patterns of behavior. The fact that behavior is different in two situations does not necessarily implies that welfare is better in one situation than in the other, because animals are flexible in their behavior. And it is also true that animals that are able to perform the full behavioral repertoire, such as it happens in nature, can still suffer. So the ability to do that, to show all behavioral patterns, is no guarantee that the welfare of the animals is going to be good. And finally, we have methodological problems, and I'm not going to deal with them. But clearly, there are limitations when we want to use natural history or natural behavior as a guiding principle to assess the welfare of animals in captivity. Having said this, however, I do think that natural behavior, and many other people do as well, including the authors of the paper I was referring to, that natural behavior is still useful, provided that we know the consequences of not being able to perform the behavior, and or we know how much the animal is willing to pay to perform the behavior. And then the question now is, do we have this sort of knowledge? Do we know which natural behaviors are important enough so that the welfare of the animal is going to be compromised when it is not able to perform them? Or if you want to put it another way, do we know which behaviors are so important that the animal is willing to pay a high price to perform them? Well, and the answer is yes, we do have a lot of knowledge on these issues. Some knowledge comes from farm animal welfare research on cows, pigs, chickens, and so on. Just to give you an example of an interesting paper by these two Dutch authors, they look at different behaviors in the main terrestrial farm species, use a number of criteria, including the intensity, duration, biological significance, and the negative welfare symptoms when the behavior was prevented. And as you can see in this table, which is actually part of a table that appears in the paper, they concluded that scratching in poultry, rooting in pigs, social contact in sows, and grazing in dairy cattle are either very important or rather important. And I will try to draw some general conclusions from this study and others later on. Now, if we look at a slightly different approach, this well-known paper by Mason and colleagues on the welfare of mink, what they did was to ask mink whether they were willing to pay a high price, an increasing price, to access some resources. There's a methodology called demand theory studies, which become quite popular in welfare studies. And basically, without getting into the details, the idea is that the lower the number in brackets, the higher the price the animal is willing to pay. So the results of this paper, which are summarized in this slide, is that having access to a water pool to swim is extremely important for the welfare of mink, or at least mink perceive that as being extremely important. Having an alternative nest site to perform nesting behavior and to hide is also very important, but not so much. And finally, having access to a raised platform is apparently less important. So just two examples to tell you that we do have knowledge from different methodologies on which behaviors animals regard as being important for the welfare, or behaviors which, when prevented, will have damaging effects on the welfare of the animals. And one tentative summary is this one here. I think that if we look carefully at the literature on farm animal welfare, on laboratory animal welfare, some stuff done with companion and zoo animals, we can conclude that we know that there are some behaviors which are likely to be important in many species. And this is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but I would like to suggest that based on current evidence, having the ability to show normal foraging behavior, positive social contact in social species, exploration, normal patterns of movement, which could be swimming, climbing, and so on, and nesting, if that applies to the species in question, and perhaps in some periods, having the ability to perform these behaviors is going to be important for the welfare of the animals. So we have another piece in our process of building up the protocol. So coupling a little bit, start with the four main areas of health, behavior, feeding, and environment. Add perception of control and choice. Combine animal-based and resource-based indicators. And when it comes to behavior, reflect upon what we have gathered from farm animals, companion animals, lab animals, and ask the right questions to know whether your animal is able to perform natural foraging, exploration, natural patterns of movement, and nesting if it applies, and in case it is a social animal, whether it has opportunities for positive social contact. Now, another important element other than behavior, feeding, and environment is health. And I like to argue now that what we know about the links between health and welfare is also extremely useful when building our assessment tools. Now, there is no doubt, I think, that physical health, understood as the absence of disease and injury, is an important part of welfare. Even if we choose to define welfare as the balance between positive and negative emotions or affective states, we have to admit that very often, if not always, disease and injury will have an effect on the emotional state of the animals. So if that is the case, then the question becomes how to build veterinary records into welfare assessments. And I would suggest that any disease could be seen as a sign of poor welfare, but however, some diseases are likely to be more relevant than others in terms of welfare or quality of life. And these particular diseases, the ones which are most relevant, the ones that we should try to include in our welfare assessment tools. So then the question becomes, what sort of criteria do we know to choose the most relevant diseases in terms of animal welfare or quality of life? And I like to suggest that when doing that choice, we have to consider two different issues. The first one relates to the fact to whether that disease is in itself a sign of poor welfare. Now, the question is, are welfare problems other than the disease itself likely to be involved? And here, basically, what I am suggesting is that those diseases which are multifactorial in nature and which are very much affected by stress or poor environments should be part of a welfare assessment tool, because when those diseases appear, that is telling us that there is a welfare problem other than the disease itself. Now, the other question refers to the effect that the disease is going to have on the quality of life of the animal. And diseases may have a negative effect on the animal's quality of life or affective state, either because they cause pain, that's the most obvious consequence, either because they cause malaise, which happens in many infectious diseases with sickness behavior, because they cause pruritus. If we think about the human medicine literature, the disease-related quality of life studies, they agree that chronic pruritus can have effects on quality of life almost as devastating as chronic pain. So think about diseases which are painful, which cause chronic pruritus, or diseases which interfere with the normal behavior of the animal, particularly those diseases that will prevent the animals from performing natural rewarding behaviors, exploration, pain, social interactions, and so on. So just to summarize it very briefly, to me, the top diseases in any welfare assessment protocols should be those that either have a negative impact on the quality of life of the animal because they are painful, cause pruritus, or interfere with normal behavior, or are diseases which are multifactorial in nature and are more likely to appear when there are other welfare problems. And from what it is worth, when I am going to start a welfare audit, or when I am preparing a welfare audit, one of the things I always do is to liaise with the vets in the facilities beforehand and ask them whether they know if a particular species or group of animals have shown over the last few months recurrent cases of diseases which fit into these groups that I just described. For example, this is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but I think that health issues such as lameness, for example, which have a high prevalence in some species, very often multifactorial and reflect painful conditions and interfere with normal behavior. Lameness should be part of any welfare assessment protocol. The same applies to dental problems, again, high prevalence in some taxonomic groups. Behavioral changes may play a role in several species. Think about marine mammals, for example, and they may cause severe pain. Chronic or recurrent skin conditions. So remember about pruritus, and also on the fact that in humans, it has been known since long that skin conditions and chronic stress, anxiety, and so on show a comorbidity. So there is a comorbidity between mental health problems and skin conditions. And the evidence we are gathering, mainly in companion animals, point to the same direction. So chronic recurrent skin conditions, again, fit this model of diseases which have an impact on quality of life and also probably reflect other underlying welfare problems. Infectious diseases caused by opportunistic pathogens, so where stress can be involved, very important. Think of some fungal diseases in penguins, in marine mammals, and so on, and many other species. And in some cases, digestive ulcers, which can be highly prevalent, and again, stress can be involved. So building up those welfare assessment tools include health-related questions, and in particular, remember these two criteria to select the key health conditions that should be included. And just a final thought about health-related issues. I like to suggest that welfare assessment tools should include a question or several questions on medical training. And that is because the negative effects of disease on welfare are not just direct effects of the disease, but they may be caused by the treatment itself. So the treatment can be stressful, may have a negative effect on the human-animal relationship, and so on. And these negative effects of the treatment on the welfare of the animals are going to be much reduced if the facility has a good medical training program in place. So that would be something I would suggest you include in your welfare assessment tools for these reasons. And finally, our last tool to build up those protocols for the species for which we don't have any published yet. I think that there are some animal-based indicators that may be applicable to many species. And it is good, I think, to have a look at some of them just as examples and consider the possibility of including them and others in your welfare assessment tool, regardless of the species you are dealing with. For example, play behavior. Now, there are many indicators of poor welfare and not so many indicators of positive welfare, which I think is something that you have to include as well in your assessment protocols. And remember, this is another general principle. Welfare is not only about the absence of the negative, it's also about the presence of the positive. So positive indicators should be there, and play is probably one of them. For many reasons, it is a low priority behavior. So animals play less or not at all when they are sick, stressed, or poorly fed. It is pleasant, so it is a potentially good positive indicator of welfare. Of course, is useful mainly for mammals and some birds. It is not that common in adult animals in some species, but still is something that you should consider, because I think that the underlying biological evidence suggests that play behavior may be useful for a wide variety of species, even species for which we do not have specific research on the links between play and welfare. I think we can take it as a general principle. And perhaps it is not only mammals and birds. There are some interesting papers suggesting that play may happen as well in other species. So remember that issue of the diversity of the species we have to deal with. So play is something I probably would consider including, because I would suggest that the biological evidence suggests that it might be generally applicable to many species. The same with affiliative behaviors or positive social behaviors, which can include social grooming, for example, or simply the fact of resting close together with another individual of the same group. I think that basic research in biology and behavioral sciences tells us that a high frequency of affiliative behaviors indicates a well-functioning social group, and that these sort of behaviors contribute to stress reduction, so better welfare, in part through biological effects mediated by oxytocin. And then just another example of a widely applicable indicator, keepers ratings. I mentioned that in a previous talk organized by the EAZA in the EAZA Congress, and I think that we have good evidence that these keepers ratings can be extremely useful. They are based on previous experiences in farm animals, the qualitative behavioral assessments, and we know that these QBA are highly correlated with more traditional measures. So include that in your welfare assessment, whichever the species you are considering, because we have good evidence that this is, again, generally applicable. Again, not meant to be a comprehensive list, but just to have a try and open it to discussion, I would suggest that abnormal repetitive behaviors, apathy, increased aggression, affiliative behavior, play, and keepers ratings would be some of the animal-based indicators which are likely to be widely applicable across species, and that I would suggest you consider including in your protocol. Just my final thought. Of course, there are we have learned that some indicators may be applicable to many species, and that's good for our efforts to assess welfare of zoo animals. But another thing we have learned is that no matter which indicator we choose to use, each indicator has limits and methodological and or conceptual problems, and we have to take that into account when building our protocol. Just to explain that with an example, cortisol or corticosterone, probably the most widely used physiological indicator of stress, and sometimes used as welfare indicator. Well, that might be good, but remember there are some constraints and possible pitfalls here. I like this slide very much. It is basic work on lab rats, looking at plasma concentration of corticosterone, which is the main glucocorticoid in rats. So the longer the bar, the higher the concentration of corticosterone, and everything looks right, except if you go to the top bar, which is the one showing the highest corticosterone concentration in plasma, which correspond to rats which anticipate mating. So mating is, according to this study, the most stressful situation rats can encounter according to this physiological indicator. And yet we don't have any reason to believe that anticipating mating is a welfare problem, probably much of the contrary, meaning that, as it is well known, plasma concentration of cortisol or corticosterone may not be terribly useful to assess welfare, because it indicates activity, or activation of the animal rather than the balance of their emotional state. But at the same time that we have learned this, we have learned as well that matrices that allow us to measure chronic activity of the HPA axis, such as hair, feathers, or scales, for example, can be extremely useful. So basic research tells us the limits, but also opens up some opportunities to add further information to our welfare assessment protocols. So again, consider that. And if you want to use physiological measures, try to probably move away from matrices which are reflecting an acute stress, which is difficult to relate with welfare, and go for those which may reflect a more chronic stress. Good, and this brings me to the final part of my talk, the summary. So basically 8 ideas or take-home messages. First, developing and validating protocols to assess the welfare of zoo animals is a major challenge, but we have tools to address it. So that's the optimistic side of the talk. One tool is that there are already several protocols that are very useful. Some of them are specific for a given species or group of species, whereas others are general and can be used on many species. And these general protocols coincide in the areas to be covered. Remember the 4 areas: health, nutrition, environment, and behavior, and the advice of using a mix of animals and resource-based indicators. Now, to add to this is whether animals have perceived control and ability to perform choices. That should be part of any welfare assessment tool. Now, knowledge of natural behavior is important and useful, provided it is used in combination with other approaches. And we, I think, are in a position to suggest that some behaviors, remember foraging, exploration, nesting, are likely to be important for the welfare of many, if not all, species. 6, information on diseases should be part of welfare assessments, and I like to advise that you choose diseases which either reflect other underlying welfare problems and or have a significant impact on the quality of life of the animals through pain, pruritus, or inability to perform rewarding behaviors. Some indicators are likely to be useful in many species, so consider including them. And finally, no matter which indicators you choose to use, remember that there are always methodological and conceptual issues that must be considered. And with this, once again, I would like to thank EAZA for inviting me to deliver this webinar, and thank you all very much for your attention and for listening. Thank you.
Many thanks, Xavier. Yes, a fascinating talk. Thank you very, very much. So we have a few questions that have come in, and I will do my best to get to everyone who has submitted. So thank you very much. So I would first like to go to 𝗫𝗃𝗏 from Moscow Zoo. So Alex, if I could ask you to unmute yourself.
Yep.
Hello, welcome.
Hello, everyone. And thank you, Javier, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I have a question about how we can split the control and choice of animal and their diversity of behavior, because you said that if animals can have diverse behavior, it can still have low level of welfare, and for me it's not very understandable how we can split control and really diversity of natural behavior, because for me it's it's on the same part of animal behavior.
Yes, I think you're right. You have a good point here. So if we allow animals to show diversity of behaviors, it is more likely that they have control over what they do. That's true. But on top of that, we have to consider as well control over imposed stressors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important in a zoo context, mainly when we think about the presence of public. So that's why I selected that particular example. So to me, what I would do in practice when building an assessment tool would be to see whether animals are able to perform those highly motivated, important behaviors. That's one thing. The other thing I would ask is whether animals can control whether they are exposed to the public, so things such as hiding structures or vegetation that allows animals to choose whether or not they are exposed, and then whether husbandry and facilities are designed in such a way that animals may, as much as possible, and of course that you have got to be realistic, but as much as possible, they may choose where they want, for example, indoors or remain outdoors, and whether they choose to perform a given behavior here or there. So I think there are three areas which overlap, yes, but they still have subtle differences. One is ability to perform natural behavior, so normal foraging, exploration, and so on. The second one is ability to control whether or not the animal is exposed to the public constantly, or it may choose not to be. And the other one is whether we design things in such a way that animals may choose to be, for example, indoors or outdoors at a given time. But I agree with you. There is an overlap, but still different implications, I think.
Yeah, I think it would be great to develop some tools that helps us to understand the real subjective control and the natural behavior, yeah, if it's work for the animals. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you, Xavier. And now hand to Paul Rose from the University of Exeter. So Paul, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Sally, and thank you, Javier, for the talk. I just had a question about normal behaviour and the welfare and the health that you talked about. So I just wondered if you had a definition of what normal behaviour could be generally, if we're judging welfare based on health conditions that affect normal behaviour, but at the same time we need to be moving away from normal behaviour as a key benchmark. How do we marry the two together?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, defining natural behaviour is always a challenge, and that's why I was trying to skip that. So there are several definitions in the literature, but the one I was basing my talk on was appeared in that paper by 𝗫𝗃 and 𝗫𝗃. Basically, they refer to natural behaviors that occur when animals are in good welfare and the behavior itself is rewarding. But now going to the more applied aspects that you were suggesting, I think we have two issues here. One is health. I think that physical health. I think that having animals in good health is a requisite for welfare. But then in practice, when you have to choose your questions, your points to address in your protocol, I would like to emphasize some diseases more than others. And the diseases I would like to emphasize are those that either have a negative impact on quality of life through pruritus, pain, or preventing the animal from behaving normally. That's one thing. And the other thing are diseases which are more likely to develop when animals are under chronic stress. That's one thing. And then the other thing is to reflect upon a subset of natural behaviors which are rewarding, highly motivated, and not environment dependent, so that animals are motivated to perform those behaviors no matter where they are, and behaviors are rewarding by themselves. And to me, we have good evidence showing that, for example, appetitive foraging behavior, so looking for food, is one example of that. We have studies about contra-free loading, animals performing abnormal behaviors when prevented from doing that appetitive behavior. Or nesting, we have plenty of evidence in domestic pigs and domestic hens showing that frustration of nesting attempts leads to stress and abnormal repetitive behavior, and some others. So I would try to separate that into two different aspects or dominions of the welfare assessment tool. And under health, I would focus on some diseases, the ones I explained, and under behavior, I would focus on natural behaviors which are a subset of natural behaviors, and let me emphasize this, subset of natural behaviors that we know are rewarding and intrinsically motivated.
Thank you very much. That was very comprehensive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And there's a couple of questions that come in that I'm going to ask on their behalf. So the first one was, do you know of any peer-reviewed articles that demonstrate tooth issues in bears and dolphins?
Yes, one comes to mind for bears, clearly, and if that person sends me an email, I'd be happy to give the reference. And there are some stuff published. I don't remember now whether there are peer-reviewed papers or communications to Congress on that particular aspect in marine mammals. So again, if that person is kind enough to contact me through email, I'd be happy to send that to him.
I will link you up, no worries at all. And we had two other questions, but they're a very, very similar ilk and came up when you were discussing Georgia Mason's paper on the mink and working for different aspects of the environment and the value of resources to animals. So it was with regards to, do you think that individual differences in levels of motivation to perform behaviours or access resources should be considered in animal welfare assessments? And if so, is there a practical way to do this?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a very, very good question, really. The answer to the first part is, yeah, clearly yes. I mean, if at all possible, I think we should never forget that animal welfare, no matter how we define it, is an attribute of the individual animal. So temperament, personality, individual differences should be taken into account. Now, how we do that? Well, that's the difficult part of it. We are already struggling to approach it from a species perspective. So going down to the individual level is even more difficult. But I would suggest that keepers' ratings, because keepers are the ones who know the peculiarities of each individual animal better than anybody else. So I think that is extremely useful to relate welfare with temperament and personality. So my answer would be yes, clearly it is important. The best way to do it is to emphasize the importance of keepers' ratings.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So right on the nose. Thank you very much, everybody. Huge thank you to you, Xavier, for a fantastic talk. Yeah, you can see in the comments afterwards, people have been really, really interested. So thank you very much for your time and sharing of your expertise.
No, thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you. To all of our participants today, thank you so much for joining us. It has been fantastic to have you here. We have our next webinar planned soon, which, bear with me 1 second, I will share my screen with you. So our next webinar is with Dr. Heather Bacon. You can see that. And it's on the 24th of November at 12 o'clock Central European time, and she's going to be discussing quality of life assessments. So please do join us for that. We will be putting the Zoom link for that on our website. It should be on there now, which is the EAZA website on the animal welfare page. And there you'll also find our animal welfare assessments library, and soon the recording of this talk will be on there, and also previous webinars we've had. So we had a lot of people, Xavier, requesting recordings of the talk to share with their teams, and yeah, that will be up there soon. So please do spread far and wide. You are very, very welcome to it. Please also join our EAZA Animal Welfare Facebook group, where we'll be promoting the webinars as they are open for registration, and also things like our Animal Welfare Forum, etc. So please do join us on that. So lastly, to say a final thank you very much, Xavier, for that fantastic talk.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for joining us.